The clock on the wall of the cold ridge bank ticked with the dry, deliberate sound of a death watch beetle. Outside, the midday sun hammered the anvil of the sky, turning the dust of the main street into a fine, shimmering powder. Inside, the air was still and cool, smelling of oiled wood and old paper. Luke Carver stood at the teller's counter, the canvas sack in his hand, heavy with the proceeds from a cattle sale. 2 months of sweat, dust, and dwindling hope finally converted into coin. It was enough to see him through the winter, enough to keep the bank from foreclosing on the land his father had carved out of this unforgiving territory. That should settle the account and leave a bit. Besides, Mr. Gable, Luke said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to absorb the room's quiet. The teller, a balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles, nodded as he counted. "It will indeed, Mr. Carver. Good to see the herd did well this year." Before Gable could finish, the batwing doors of the bank swung inward with a violent crash that shattered the placid afternoon. 4 men filled the doorway, their long dusters failing to conceal the rifles they held at the ready. Their faces were obscured by bandanas, all but for the man who stepped through their ranks to lead them. He wore no mask. His name was Silas Blackwood, though Luke did not know it then. He was a man built of sharp angles and cold composure, with eyes the color of a winter sky and a mouth set in a line of wry contempt. He moved with an unnerving grace, his polished boots making no sound on the floorboards. "Ladies and gentlemen," Silas began, his voice surprisingly cultured, a blade wrapped in velvet. "This is a reallocation of assets. Please remain calm, and you will remain unharmed." His men moved with practiced efficiency, one covering the door, 2 herding the half-dozen customers and staff against the far wall. Panic, thin and sharp, pricked the air. Mr. Gable's hands froze over the stacks of coin. Luke's own hand instinctively went to the Colt peacemaker holstered at his hip, but a rifle barrel pressed firmly between his shoulder blades stopped the motion before it began. He slowly raised his hands. Silas strolled to the counter, his gaze sweeping over the scene with disinterest, until his eyes landed on Luke. They narrowed, a flicker of something dark and ancient passing through them. He ignored the money on the counter, his focus fixed entirely on Luke. "You," Silas said the word, a soft command. He rounded the counter and stood before him. Luke, a head taller and broader in the shoulder, met his gaze without flinching. The silence stretched thick and heavy, broken only by the frantic ticking of the clock. Silas's eyes drifted downward to the faint silver chain visible at the collar of Luke's shirt. With a flick of his wrist, he reached out and snagged it, pulling a small tarnished silver locket into the light. It was oval-shaped, intricately engraved with the initials E.C. and M.C. Luke's blood ran cold. "Don't," he said, the single word, layered with a warning as deep and resonant as a thunderclap on the horizon. Silas smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips. "What's this? A family heirloom?" He pried it open with his thumbnail. Inside, the miniature, hand-painted portraits of a man and a woman stared out Elias and Mary Carver, Luke's parents. The locket was all he had left of them, a tangible piece of a life scorched from the earth years ago. "Give it back," Luke said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The rifle barrel dug deeper into his back. "Everything has a price," my friend Silas murmured, his eyes still on the portraits. He seemed to be studying them, memorizing them. "And some debts are paid not in coin, but in memory." He snapped the locket shut and slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. Then, as if the matter were settled, he turned to his men. "The vault. Be quick about it." The rest of the robbery was a blur of violence and efficiency. Sacks were filled, the safe was emptied, and within minutes the men were backing toward the door. Silas paused one last time, his gaze finding Luke's across the room. There was no greed in his eyes, no triumph of a successful thief. there was something else, something deeply personal and chillingly patient. It was the look of a man, not taking something, but reclaiming it. Then they were gone, melting back into the blinding glare of the sun. The hollow void they left behind was filled only by the ticking of the teller's clock and the frantic hammering beat of Luke's own heart. He didn't care about the stolen money on the counter. He didn't care about the bank's loss. All he could feel was the phantom weight of the locket against his chest, an emptiness that ached more than any physical wound. The robbery hadn't been about money. It had been about him, and Luke Carver had no idea why. He returned to the ranch as dusk bled its deep bruised purple across the plains. The ride from Cold Ridge was a silent meditation on loss. The ranch was a solitary kingdom of dust and wind, a testament to his parents' grit and his own stubborn refusal to let their memory fade. The cabin he had built with his own hands stood dark against the horizon, every beam and board a monument to his loneliness. Inside, the air was stale with it. A rough-hewn table, a small stove, and a single wooden bed were the only furnishings. The years since his parents' death in the drought-fueled fire had been a long, quiet conversation with ghosts. He unsaddled his horse, the familiar motions, a small comfort in a world suddenly thrown off its axis. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and the distant, mournful howl of a coyote. It was a sound he knew well, the anthem of solitude. But tonight, it felt different. It felt like a warning. In the days that followed, a shadow fell over the valley. Silas Blackwood was no mere bandit. He moved into the old McGregor place, a sprawling, neglected ranch that bordered Luke's land to the east. He brought with him a dozen hard-faced men and a seemingly bottomless well of cash. He wasn't hiding. He was setting up a throne. One by one, the smaller ranchers in the area began to sell. First, old man Hemlock, his water rights bought for a price no one believed. Then the Connolly brothers, who packed up in the middle of the night after a disagreement with Blackwood's men, left their barn a smoldering ruin. Silas was a blight, spreading methodically, isolating Luke's property until it was an island in a sea of Blackwood land. The town of Cold Ridge, once wary of Luke's quiet stoicism, now looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. Sheriff Miller, a world-weary man, whose authority seemed to end at the saloon doors, offered hollow condolences. There's no law against a man buying land, Luke. His coin is good. It's blood money, Luke had replied, his voice flat. Maybe so, Miller had sighed, polishing his badge with a worn thumb. But it spends just the same. Luke knew he was being cornered. He patrolled his fence lines daily, his Winchester rifle a permanent companion across his saddle. It was during one of these patrols near the northern edge of his property, where the land crumbled into rocky, inhospitable canyons, that he found her. He was investigating a cut fence, a deliberate clean snip through the wire, when he saw the tracks. Not a man's boot prints, but the smaller moccasined feet of someone moving with haste. He followed them into a narrow wash, the air shimmering over the cracked alkali flats. And there, huddled in the scant shade of a mesquite tree, was a woman. She was Apache, her black hair matted with sweat and dirt, her buckskin dress torn. A dark, ugly stain spread across her shoulder, and her arm was held stiffly at her side. She wasn't dying of thirst, as he first thought, but of a wound. As he drew closer, she scrambled backward, her dark eyes flashing with a weary fire, a cornered animal ready to fight to the last breath. A crudely made knife fashioned from a shard of rock appeared in her hand. "Easy now," Luke said, keeping his voice low, and even his hands held open and away from his gun. "I'm not going to hurt you." She watched him, her breathing shallow and ragged. He could see she was in pain, her face pale beneath its sun-scorched tone. She was hiding. And out here, the only thing to hide from was Silas Blackwood. "You're on Carver land," he said, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. "Blackwood's men don't ride this far." Her eyes flickered with recognition at the name, a confirmation of his suspicion. He took another slow step forward, kneeling down, so he was no longer looming over her. He unhooked his canteen from his belt and held it out. "Water," he said simply. She stared at the canteen for a long moment, then at his face. He saw the war within her instinct battling exhaustion. Finally, her hand trembled as she reached for it. She drank, the sound of her swallowing loud in the oppressive silence. When she was done, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and handed it back, her gaze never leaving his. "That wound needs tending," he said, nodding toward her shoulder. "You can't stay out here." "I will be fine," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "No, you won't," Luke stated plainly. "Blackwood's men will find you, or the infection will." He stood up slowly. "My cabin is a mile from here. It's safe. You can rest there." She was wary, her distrust a palpable shield. But she was also intelligent enough to know he was right. She looked from the direction of his cabin, back toward the vast, empty wilderness, a place that offered no sanctuary. With a pained grimace, she used the rock wall to push herself to her feet, swaying unsteadily. "My name is Luke Carver," he said, extending a hand to steady her. She hesitated before taking it. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Nellie," she said the name, a soft breath of air. He helped her onto his horse, the effort making her gasp in pain, and mounted behind her. As they rode toward the cabin, the setting sun cast their long shadow across the land, two solitary figures bound together by the menace of a common enemy. Her presence was an unexpected complication, another life he was now responsible for. But as he felt her lean against him for support, a flicker of something long dormant stirred within him. For the first time in years, the silence of his life had been broken by something other than the wind. Inside the cabin, the light from the oil lamp cast warm, dancing shadows on the walls. Luke gently eased Nellie into a chair, and the single room suddenly feeling smaller, more intimate. He lit the stove, the crackle of kindling a welcome sound, and put a pot of water on, to boil. "I need to see that wound," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Nellie watched him with a hawk's intensity, her body tense. But as he moved, not with threat, but with a quiet, focused competence, some of the rigidity left her. She slowly unlaced the side of her buckskin dress, allowing him to pull the fabric away from her shoulder. The wound was a ragged gash, inflamed and angry, clearly made by a bullet that had grazed the flesh. It was shallow, but dirty. "Hold still," he commanded softly. He cleaned the wound with boiled water and a clean rag, his hands surprisingly gentle for a man whose palms were calloused from years of hard labor. Nellie winced, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the table, but she made no sound. He applied a salve of his own, making a mixture of pine tar and herbs his mother had taught him to prepare, and bound the injury with strips of clean cotton. "It'll heal," he said, stepping back. "But you need to rest." He gestured to the wooden bed in the corner, the only one in the house. "You take the bed. I'll sleep on the porch." She said nothing, but her eyes conveyed a message of reluctant gratitude. He placed a bowl of hot broth on the table before her. "Eat. You'll feel better." As she sipped the broth, Luke sat across from her, cleaning his rifle. The silence between them was no longer one of suspicion, but of quiet assessment. He saw the calculation in her eyes as she scanned the room. The Winchester by the door, the knife on the table, the single window at the back. He understood. Survival was a language they both spoke fluently. "I am not going to hurt you," he said again, his voice steady. "You are safe here." Later, as he lay on the porch bench, his rifle within reach, he listened to the sounds of the night. The wind hissed across the roof, and somewhere far off, a wolf called to the moon. He could hear Nellie's soft, even breathing from inside. She hadn't left. Her presence had altered the fundamental chemistry of the place. The cabin, once a shell for his grief, now felt like a fortress. A very small, very vulnerable fortress, with only 2 defenders. The attack came 3 nights later under the cloak of a moonless sky. The first warning was the nervous whinny of his horse from the corral. Luke was awake instantly, his hand closing around the stock of his Winchester. He moved to the window, peering into the inky blackness. At first he saw nothing. Then a flicker of movement near the barn. "Get down," he whispered into the darkness of the cabin. Nellie was already moving her bare feet silent on the floorboards. Her shoulder was still bandaged, but she held a heavy iron skillet like a weapon, her eyes wide and alert in the faint starlight filtering through the window. A torch bloomed to life in the distance, then another. They weren't trying to be subtle. This wasn't a sneak attack. It was a message. A voice rough and laced with whiskey cut through the night. "Carver Blackwood sent his regards. Says this land would look a whole lot better without your ugly cabin on it." A gunshot cracked, and a slug splintered the wood of the doorframe. Luke didn't hesitate. He raised his Winchester, aimed for the torchlight, and fired. The torch fell sputtering in the dirt, followed by a curse. "They're trying to draw us out," Nellie breathed from her position near the stove. "They're going to try to burn us out," Luke corrected grimly. He'd seen the hay piled high in the barn. It would go up like a tinderbox. He moved to the back window while Nellie watched the front. The plan was simple: keep them at a distance, make them think twice. Another shot rang out this time, shattering the front window. Glass sprayed across the floor. Nellie ducked but didn't flinch. For the next hour, the cabin became a bastion under siege. Gunshots echoed across the valley, flashes of light tearing through the oppressive dark. Luke was a measured, deadly marksman. He didn't fire wildly. Each shot was deliberate, aimed not to kill, but to disable, to drive them back. He targeted muzzle flashes, kicking up dirt near their feet, forcing them to stay under cover. Inside, Nellie proved her own worth. She reloaded his spare revolver with a speed and dexterity that surprised him, her hands steady despite the chaos. When one of the thugs made a desperate run for the woodpile beside the cabin, intending to start a fire, she was the one who saw him. She didn't scream or shout. She simply pointed, and Luke's rifle roared. The man yelped and scrambled back into the darkness, clutching his leg. The town less than 5 miles away must have heard the gunfire. But no help came. The silence from Cold Ridge was as loud as the gunshots. Luke and Nellie were on their own, a fact that settled in Luke's gut like a cold stone. He had been a part of that community his entire life, yet Silas Blackwood's money had bought their silence, their cowardice. Finally, as the first hint of violet light touched the eastern horizon, the attack subsided. The remaining thugs, likely having lost their nerve or their ammunition, faded back into the hills. The silence that descended was heavy, ringing in their ears. Luke cautiously surveyed the yard. The ground was littered with spent cartridges. The barn door was splintered but standing. They had held. He turned back into the cabin. Nellie was still by the door, where the iron skillet lowered but held at the ready. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes luminous in the pre-dawn gloom. They looked at each other, the shared danger forging a bond that words never could. "They'll be back," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "I know," Luke replied. He leaned his rifle against the wall, the warmth of the barrel a familiar sensation against his skin. His gaze fell on her bandaged shoulder, then on the skillet she still held. "You did good." A small, weary smile touched her lips. "We did." In that moment, the fight was no longer just his. It was theirs. The land, the cabin, the very air they breathed, they were defending it together. The town may have abandoned him, but he was no longer alone. In the wake of the attack, a new rhythm established itself on the ranch. The days were spent fortifying their position. They boarded up the broken window, reinforced the cabin door with an iron strap from the barn, and dug a shallow trench along the northern approach to the house. The work was hard done under the constant oppressive watch of the sun, but it was shared. As they worked, a quiet trust began to grow between them. It was built not on conversation, but on shared action and mutual respect. Luke saw in Nellie a resilience that mirrored the harsh beauty of the land itself. She never complained about the pain in her shoulder or the meager rations. She learned to handle a rifle with a steady hand and a keen eye, her movements economical and precise. Nellie, in turn, saw beyond Luke's gruff, solitary exterior. She saw the way he cared for his horse, the gentleness in his hands when he mended a saddle, the deep, abiding grief in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She saw a man bound to a piece of land by more than just a deed. He was tied to it by memory and honor. One evening, as they sat on the porch cleaning their weapons, the silence between them felt comfortable, familiar. "Why do you stay?" Nellie asked softly, her gaze on the distant darkening hills. "You could sell. Take the money and leave this trouble behind." Luke finished oiling the action of his Winchester before answering. "This land, it's all that's left of them," he said, his voice low. "My parents, they poured their lives into this soil. Leaving would be like burying them a second time." He paused and then looked at her. "Why does Blackwood want it so badly? It's dry, rocky. There's better ranch land to the south." Nellie was silent for a long time, tracing the patterns in the wooden porch with her finger. Sometimes she said, her voice barely a whisper, "It is not the land people want. It is what the land represents." She spoke of her own people, of ancestral grounds that held the stories of generations' lands that were sacred not for their resources, but for their spirit. And she spoke of a great fire years ago, a tragedy that had scattered her tribe and marked the land with a sorrow that had never faded. "It happened not far from here," she murmured. "A terrible fire that burned for days. My people were blamed. We were driven away." Her story resonated with a chilling familiarity. Luke's parents had died in a fire. The official report, which he had never questioned, called it an accident. A lantern knocked over in the barn during a dry, windy night. But now, a seed of doubt began to sprout in the barren ground of his certainty. The next day, driven by this new unease, Luke rode into town, leaving Nellie to stand watch. He went to the sheriff's office. The small, dusty room was empty, except for Sheriff Miller, who was staring out the window, a cup of cold coffee in his hand. "Miller," Luke said, getting straight to the point, "I want to see the report on my parents' death." The sheriff turned, his expression weary. "Luke, that was years ago. What's the point in digging up old ghosts?" "Just get it," Luke insisted. With a heavy sigh, Miller retrieved a ledger from a locked cabinet. He flipped through the brittle, yellowed pages until he found the entry. The report was brief, clinical. Elias and Mary Carver, deceased. Cause accidental fire. Origin overturned lantern in barn. No foul play suspected. It was exactly as he remembered. But something was missing. Were there any witnesses, Luke asked. Just the folks who saw the smoke. By the time anyone got out there, the whole place was an inferno. Who owned the land bordering theirs back then? Miller frowned, thinking. To the east, that was the McGregor place, same as now. To the west, that was the Blackwood Ranch. The name hit Luke like a physical blow. Blackwood. I thought they all... They did, Miller finished grimly. The whole family died in that same fire. It jumped the creek bed. Their ranch house was timber went up like a matchstick. The only reason it was ruled an accident on your parents' part was because the fire started in your barn. It was a tragedy all around. Wiped out 2 families in one night. He shook his head. There was one survivor, I heard. A young boy, sent back east to live with relatives. Never heard from again. Luke stood frozen, the pieces clicking into place with a terrifying logic. Silas Blackwood. The locket. The methodical destruction of his life. This wasn't about land. It was about something that had happened on a windy night over a decade ago. He left the sheriff's office in a daze and went to the general store. The proprietor, Hobbs, a man whose opinions were as sour as the pickles in the barrel by the door, watched him with narrowed eyes. Looking for something, Carver? I need to send a telegram, Luke said, ignoring the man's hostility. He wired an old army acquaintance who now worked as a clerk in the territorial capital, asking for any records on a family named Blackwood from the Cold Ridge area, specifically any surviving members. As he was leaving, he noticed an old faded photograph tacked to the wall behind the counter, a picture of the town's founding families at a 4th of July picnic. He saw his parents younger and smiling, and standing near them, a stern-faced man and his wife, with their 2 young children. Who are they? Luke asked, pointing to the family. Hobbs squinted. That's the Blackwoods. Proud people. Kept to themselves mostly. Had some kind of feud with your father, as I recall. Something about water rights. A feud. The official report had mentioned nothing of a feud. The ride back to the ranch was fraught with a new dawning horror. The past was not dead. It had been lying in wait. When he reached the cabin, he didn't go inside. He went to the old smoke-stained chest at the foot of his bed, where he kept his parents' few remaining possessions. He dug past his mother's Bible and his father's worn leather gloves until his fingers found a small tin box. Inside were letters. He'd never read them, the pain, too raw. Now he forced himself. He read by the dying light of the sun, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The letters were mostly from his father to a cousin, detailing the struggles of the ranch. And there it was, in his father's familiar script. The dispute with Blackwood worsens. He seeks to dam the creek upstream, which would leave our land barren. He is a hard man, and I fear this will not end peacefully. The last letter was dated the day before the fire. Blackwood has threatened me directly. He says he will see me ruined, that he will burn me off my own land if he has to. I have reported this to the sheriff, but he dismisses it as bluster. I pray he is right. Luke let the letter fall from his hand. His father hadn't started the fire. He had been a victim, and the man who had survived the boy sent back east. He had returned, not for justice, for revenge. Armed with this terrible new knowledge, Luke knew he had to face him. He couldn't wait for the next attack. He saddled his horse the next morning, his jaw set like granite. "Where are you going?" Nellie asked, her hand on his horse's reins. "To see Blackwood," he said. "That is foolish," she stated, her dark eyes filled with concern. "He will kill you." Maybe Luke acknowledged, but I'm tired of living under his shadow. It's time he and I had a talk. He found Silas on the porch of the old McGregor house, sitting in a rocking chair, sipping coffee from a porcelain cup, as if he were a king surveying his domain. His men were scattered around the yard, their rifles never far from hand. They tensed as Luke rode up, but Silas held up a hand, a gesture of calm command. Luke Carver's Silas set a thin smile on his lips. "I was wondering when you'd pay me a visit." Please dismount. Join me. Luke swung down from his horse, his duster sweeping back to reveal the colt at his hip. He walked toward the porch, stopping at the bottom step. I know who you are. Silas's smile widened. Do you? I doubt that. You know my name, perhaps. But you have no idea who I am. You're the boy who survived the fire. Luke said, his voice flat and cold. The one who lost his family. The smile vanished from Silas's face, replaced by a mask of cold fury. He stood up, his body rigid. My father was a good man, a proud man. He built a life from nothing. And your father, Elias Carver, a greedy, jealous man, took it all away. He couldn't stand to see another man succeed. He diverted the creek to water his own cattle, leaving ours to die of thirst. When my father confronted him, yours threatened him. And then one night, he made good on that threat. He set a fire that took my father, my mother, my sister. His voice was low, trembling, with a rage that had been simmering for over a decade. I watched it from the hills where I was playing. I watched the flames swallow my home. I watched them leap the creek and consume your barn, a paltry price for what he did. The official story was an accident. But I know the truth. I have always known. Luke felt the ground shift beneath his feet. This wasn't just a man seeking revenge for a perceived wrong. This was a man living in a reality built on a foundation of grief and lies. My father didn't start that fire. Luke said, his voice ringing with conviction. He wrote a letter the day before saying your father threatened to burn him out. Silas laughed, a harsh grating sound. A convenient lie, written to protect himself. My revenge is not about this worthless land carver. It is about justice. It's about erasing every trace of your family's name from this valley, just as he erased mine. The locket I took from you, he pulled it from his pocket, letting it dangle from his fingers. This is a symbol of the life your father stole from me, a life of family, of legacy, and I will not stop until I have taken everything from you. The confrontation ended with a stalemate of glares. Luke knew he could not win a gunfight here, not against a dozen men. And he couldn't win an argument against a man whose certainty was forged in the fires of childhood trauma. He rode away with a heavier burden than before. Silas didn't just want his land. He wanted his history, his father's name, his very existence. And he was using the town as his weapon. The story spread through Cold Ridge like a poison. Silas Blackwood, the tragic orphan, returned to seek justice for his murdered family. Luke Carver, the son of an arsonist and a killer. It was a simple, powerful narrative, and the townspeople, eager for drama and swayed by Silas's wealth, embraced it. The whispers that had once followed Nellie now trailed Luke. Doors closed as he passed. Old friends avoided his gaze. He and Nellie were utterly, completely alone. The final blow came in the form of Sheriff Miller, who rode out to the ranch one afternoon, his face a mask of grim reluctance. "Luke, I've got a warrant here," he said, not meeting his eyes. "Blackwood's filed charges, cattle rustling. Says you've been stealing from his herd." "That's a lie, and you know it," Luke said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It doesn't matter what I know," Miller confessed, his own shame evident in his tone. "He's got 3 ranch hands who'll swear they saw you do it. It's his word against yours. And right now, his word carries more weight in this town." "So you're just going to let him get away with this?" Nellie demanded, stepping onto the porch beside Luke. The sheriff's eyes flickered toward her. "And that's the other thing. He's also put out a bounty for an Apache woman wanted in connection with a stagecoach robbery down south. Says he recognized you." Luke looked at Nellie. Her face was pale. The story was a fabrication, but a dangerous one. In this territory, such an accusation was as good as a death sentence. "He's giving you a choice," Miller said finally, looking Luke in the eye. "He'll drop all the charges. He'll even call off the bounty. All you have to do is sign the deed to your land over to him. He wants you gone by midnight tomorrow." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was a masterful checkmate. Silas had cornered him legally, socially, and now personally. To stay and fight meant a hangman's noose for him and a bounty hunter's bullet for Nellie. "Midnight tomorrow," Miller repeated, then turned his horse and rode away, leaving them in a profound and desolate silence. The choice was clear: his family's legacy or Nellie's life. As the sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows across the valley, a change came over the sky. The air grew still and heavy, charged with an electric tension. The horizon to the west turned a sickly yellow-brown. A dust storm was coming. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was as thick as the air outside. Luke stood by the window, watching the approaching wall of dust, his mind a maelstrom of impossible choices. Nellie came to stand beside him. "You should not do this for me," she said softly. "This land is your life. A life isn't worth much if you have to sacrifice someone else for it." He replied, his voice rough. He turned to face her. "He thinks he has us trapped. But he's forgotten one thing." "What is that?" "He thinks my father and his were the only people on this land back then." Luke's gaze was intense. "You told me your people were driven from here after that fire. You said you were blamed? What if the person who set the fire wasn't my father or his? What if it was someone who wanted you both gone?" Nellie's eyes widened as the implication of his words sank in. "A third party. Someone who wanted all the land. The Carver Ranch, the Blackwood Ranch, and the lands your people lived on." He thought of the feud over water rights, a conflict that would benefit anyone who could gain control of the creek. "My grandfather," Nellie whispered, a distant memory surfacing. "He spoke of it. Before he died, he told me the story of the fire. He said he saw a white man that night near the creek. Not Carver, not Blackwood. A stranger. He was carrying something. A totem from our village. He must have stolen it." Her hand went to a small leather pouch she wore around her neck, one Luke had never seen her open. "My grandfather said the man dropped it as he ran from the flames. He found it in the ashes days later." Her fingers trembled as she pulled the drawstring. From within, she produced a small carved wooden figure of a hawk. It was blackened and scarred by fire, the wood warped by intense heat, but it was unmistakable. "He said the man had a face like a coyote." She continued, her voice gaining strength. "Always smiling, even when he was lying. A land speculator. He had tried to buy the land from everyone. From my people. From your father. From Blackwood. Everyone refused him." Luke stared at the fire-scarred totem. It was tangible proof. A piece of the past that could rewrite the present. It wouldn't mean much in a formal court of law, but in the court of public opinion, in a saloon full of men who respected courage and truth more than legal documents, it could be everything. The first gust of wind hit the cabin, rattling the windows. The dust storm was nearly upon them. Midnight. Luke said, his decision made. That's his deadline. We'll meet it. But not here. He looked at Nellie, his eyes blazing with a desperate, defiant hope. "We're going into town." The journey to Cold Ridge was a battle against the elements. The wind howled like a banshee, flaying them with sand and grit that stung their eyes and choked their lungs. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of brown dust, visibility reduced to a few feet. It was a storm that mirrored the chaos in their hearts, a physical manifestation of the turmoil they faced. They left the horses at the edge of town and proceeded on foot, leaning into the gale. The streets were deserted, the buildings groaning under the wind's assault. The only light came from the saloon, its windows glowing like two defiant eyes in the raging storm. Inside, the air was thick with smoke whiskey and the nervous energy of men trapped by the weather. Silas Blackwood sat at a corner table, a bottle of whiskey and a single glass before him. His men were arrayed around the room, a silent, menacing presence. Sheriff Miller stood by the bar, looking miserable. In the center of the room, a grandfather clock ticked ominously its hands, nearing midnight. The saloon doors burst open, and Luke and Nellie stepped inside, cloaked in dust. A hush fell over the room. Every eye turned to them. Silas smiled, a slow, confident curl of his lips. He lifted his glass in a mock toast. "Carver. Punctual. I assume you have the signed deed." Luke walked toward the center of the room, Nellie at his side. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at the faces of the townspeople, Hobbs, the ranchers who had sold out the men who had whispered behind his back. "I came to tell you a story," Luke announced, his voice carrying over the howl of the wind outside. "A story about a fire. The one that made an orphan of Silas Blackwood and a monster of my father." He recounted what he had learned, his voice steady and clear. He spoke of his father's letters, of the feud over water rights, and of Blackwood's threats. Silas listened, his expression one of amused contempt. "A touching story," Carver Silas drawled when Luke had finished. "Crafted by a desperate man. But it's hearsay. You have no proof." "He does not." Nellie said, her voice ringing out clear and strong, cutting through the smoky air. All eyes turned to her. She stepped forward, her fear overshadowed by a profound ancestral dignity. "But I do." She held up the fire-scarred totem. "This belongs to my people. It was stolen from our village on the night of the fire by the man who set it." She looked directly at Silas, but her words were for the room. "My grandfather saw him. He was not Elias Carver. He was not your father. He was a land speculator who wanted all of you gone. He set the fire in the Carver barn, knowing the wind would carry it to the Blackwood Ranch and toward my people's camp. He wanted to wipe the board clean." A murmur rippled through the saloon. This was a new piece of the puzzle, one that didn't fit Silas's neat narrative of revenge. Silas's composure finally cracked. A flicker of uncertainty, of rage, crossed his face. Lies, the lies of a savage to protect her lover. "Was his name Abernathy?" Luke asked, suddenly remembering the name from one of his father's letters, the speculator who had made a low offer on the land just weeks before the fire. At the name, a grizzled old rancher in the back of the room looked up. "Abernathy, slick fellow with a coyote's grin. He tried to buy me out that same year. When I refused my prize, bull turned up dead." Another man spoke up. "He offered me cash for my deed, said the whole valley was about to go bust from the drought." The foundation of Silas's world, built on a 15-year-old lie, was crumbling around him. His quest for righteous vengeance was being exposed as a tragic, misguided vendetta. He stared at the totem in Nellie's hand, as if it were a venomous snake. The truth was a poison he could not stomach. "Enough," he roared, his voice cracking. He kicked back his chair and drew his revolver. The room exploded into chaos. Silas fired not at Luke, but at Nellie. Luke moved faster than he ever had in his life, shoving her to the ground as the bullet whistled past her head and shattered the mirror behind the bar. In the same motion, Luke drew his own Colt. The saloon became a maelstrom of flickering lamplight, shouting men, and the deafening roar of the gunfire. Blackwood's men opened fire, and the townsmen scrambled for cover. Luke and Silas were locked in a deadly duel in the center of the room. The air was filled with splintering wood and the acrid smell of gunpowder. A lamp was shot, plunging one side of the room into dancing shadows. Luke fired his shot, catching one of Silas's men in the shoulder. He saw Sheriff Miller, finally spurred to action, draw his own weapon and take cover behind the bar, returning fire. This was no longer just Luke's fight. It was the town's. Silas was a man, possessed his face, a mask of primal fury. His eloquent demeanor had been stripped away, revealing the raw, wounded boy underneath. He fired wildly, his shots tearing through the walls. He was no longer fighting for land or for justice. He was fighting the ghost of a truth he refused to accept. Luke took cover behind an overturned card table. He had a clear shot at Silas, who was reloading, his back momentarily exposed. This was his chance to end it, to put a bullet in the man who had tormented him. But as he took aim, he saw the locket which had fallen from Silas's pocket lying on the floor between them. He saw the frantic, desperate grief in Silas's eyes. This was not a monster. This was a man broken by a lie he had carried his whole life. Luke lowered his aim. He fired not at Silas's heart, but at the gun in his hand. The pistol clattered from Silas's grasp. At the same moment, a shot from Sheriff Miller's rifle struck Silas in the leg. He cried out and collapsed to the floor, his long, tragic war finally over. As the last echo of gunfire faded, the only sound was the howling of the wind and the ticking of the grandfather clock, its hands having just passed midnight. The dust storm broke with the dawn. As the first rays of sun cut through the clearing air, they illuminated a town changed. The dust settled literally and figuratively. Silas Blackwood, wounded and defeated, was locked in the sheriff's jail cell, his remaining men having surrendered. The truth of the fire, pieced together from Nellie's testimony, and the corroborating stories of the old-timers, had spread through the town with the morning light. Sheriff Miller, his face etched with a new resolve, found Luke outside the saloon. "Abernathy," he said, shaking his head. "We sent a wire. He was arrested for fraud in a land scheme down in Arizona 5 years ago. Died in prison. It seems he got away with murder for a long time." He looked at Luke, his eyes filled with a respect that had been absent before. "I'm sorry, Luke. We let a smooth-talking man with a pocket full of coin blind us." Later that morning, as Luke and Nellie prepared to ride back to the ranch, a small delegation of townsfolk approached, led by a humbled Hobbs. The shopkeeper held Luke's canvas sack of money from the bank. "This is yours, Carver," Hobbs said, his voice gruff with embarrassment. "The bank's making it right, and we were wrong. About you, about your father." He glanced at Nellie, a flicker of shame in his eyes. "About you, miss. This town owes you both an apology." Luke simply nodded, taking the sack. There was no triumph in his victory, only a profound weariness. He and Nellie mounted up and rode out of Cold Ridge, leaving the town to reckon with its own conscience. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the landscape washed clean by the storm. Their shared ordeal had forged a bond between them, stronger than iron, a silent understanding that needed no words. The cabin, when it came into view, no longer looked like a lonely outpost, but like a sanctuary. It looked like home. Months passed. The rains came, turning the parched earth a vibrant green. The ranch, once a place of sorrow and struggle, began to thrive under their shared care. The fences were mended, the herd grew, and the silence that filled the cabin was no longer one of loneliness, but of peaceful companionship. The town left them be, their respect now offered from a quiet, respectful distance. One clear autumn afternoon, Luke took Nellie to a small, quiet rise overlooking the creek. 2 simple wooden crosses marked the spot where his parents were buried. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. In his hand, he held the silver locket. He had cleaned the tarnish away, and it shone brightly in the sun. He didn't open it. He no longer needed to. He had made peace with the ghosts of the past. He gently placed the locket on the wooden cross that bore his father's name, letting it rest against the weathered wood. It was a final letting go, a return of memory to its rightful place. He felt Nellie's hand slip into his. He turned away from the graves, his back to the past, and faced her. He saw in her dark, steady eyes not the wounded woman he had found in the canyon, but a partner, a survivor, a future. "It is a good place," she said softly, looking out over the rolling hills of their land. "It is," he agreed. She smiled, a quiet, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I have been teaching myself the words for this place in my own tongue. But I will teach them to you too." She squeezed his hand. The word for home, and the word for family. The sun warmed their faces, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwood trees by the creek. The land was no longer a burden of legacy or a battlefield of memory. It was a promise, a place of rebirth, a quiet corner of the world where two solitary souls had found a reason to stay.